The winter in the Hürtgen Forest resembled a sheet of iron that kept collapsing under its own weight. Mud, broken timber, and drifting fog fused into a single, shifting surface that made every road look as if it had been recut by the war only the day before. Sergeant Thomas Hayes of the 4th Infantry Division served as a lineman in this landscape, repairing cables that were severed by shell fire day after day. Over time, he learned to distinguish the faint internal movements of the forest, the tremor of branches shaken loose, the subtle displacement of soil under pressure, the muted reverberation that passed through tree trunks when an explosion struck nearby. Each sign reminded him that the ground around him had reached its limits and that any repair he completed might lose its meaning with the next burst of fire. He had no other option. As a communications soldier, his work determined whether the entire front could still coordinate its movements. The farther he was driven toward isolation, the more he clung to a rigid precision that resembled anger more than discipline. Writing letters became the only order he could impose on the chaos. Whenever he found a brief moment of calm, he used clean scraps of packaging paper to record the fact that he was still alive, pressing the presence of his family against his chest, as if continuing to write might allow him to remain connected to a world that had once been stable. On that morning, the fog was thicker than usual. The cable ran across a slope that had been scoured open by mortar fire. As Hayes checked the tension of the line, the air dipped under a familiar vibration. He recognized the signal of a mortar adjusting its aim, but he had no time to warn the others. Tree trunks bent under the shockwave. The squad split apart as debris rained down. Hayes fell into a shallow gully. His ears rang violently, and before the sound faded, he could already hear the rapid, coordinated footsteps of a German patrol closing in from the tree line. He tried to move along the trench in retreat, but falling fragments and converging fire forced him to stop. Mud erupted at his feet, and the smell of rotting leaves mixed with the sharp metallic odor of explosives. 2 German soldiers slid down the slope, blocking his escape with fixed bayonets. He raised his hands, but the gesture carried a clear resistance. It was less a surrender than a refusal to accept how little time remained before surrender became unavoidable. The task of escorting him fell to Unteroffizier Erich Hoffman. The expression on Hoffman's face was not anger but a deep, exhausted numbness. He neither inflicted unnecessary violence on the prisoner nor showed any sign of hesitation. He simply executed the order. He pulled Hayes into the formation and directed him along a narrow track through the forest. The march soon dissolved into a suffocating silence. The ground collapsed unevenly beneath their feet. Mud clung to their ankles, and the air still carried the metallic haze of half-dissipated blasts. Hayes held himself stiff, refusing to let his steps appear submissive, yet the uneven terrain forced his posture downward. Hoffman walked half a pace behind him, his steps heavy but controlled, as if he maintained balance not for the march, but for some internal, unspoken reason. Neither man knew that the real danger did not lie in the shifting fire lines or the hidden positions deeper in the woods. It waited in an inspection yet to occur. The letter Hayes kept close to his body, his final piece of order, would soon be torn open during a routine search, and that tear would shift the route of the escort in ways neither army intended. The escort halted in the forest, not as part of a plan, but because the fog and the fallen branches restricted visibility. The point man motioned for a quick inspection to ensure the prisoner carried nothing concealed. Hayes was pushed against a half-fallen spruce. His breathing tightened from the long march. Cold air brushed the inside of his chest like a faint blade. He understood what would follow, but the letter in his inner pocket was the last intact structure he possessed. With his wrists bound, he could not shield it. He could only brace himself and wait. One of the soldiers jerked his coat open with a swift, rough motion. The letter, creased from being folded many times, slid from his pocket. Sweat from previous marches had dampened its surface. The soldier had no patience to read it carefully. He treated it only as a suspicious item and tore it apart. The crackle of splitting paper sounded harsh in the damp air. The crease gave way instantly. Half the sheet fell into the mix of slush and soil, while the other half was shoved back against Hayes's chest. To the escort, this was nothing more than routine, but to Hayes, the tearing of that letter was a blow he could not immediately absorb. He made no visible motion, yet his shoulders tightened and his breathing faltered, reactions more difficult to suppress than fear itself. A man stripped of everything on the front could endure losing equipment, warmth and safety, but not the rupture of the one remaining link to his home. As the soldiers continued searching his pockets, Hoffman noticed the fallen half-sheet. Moisture had already softened its fibers, its edges curled upward, and the pencil strokes had begun to feather. He bent to pick it up, perhaps only to prevent it from being trampled. As he shook off the clinging mud, a single line of handwriting emerged clearly enough to read, "If I die, tell my child I was not a bad man." The sentence remained unbroken where the paper had been preserved, though mud obscured portions of the letters. Hoffman stared at the fragment far longer than such an inspection required. His fingers pressed into the paper as though it were not the prisoner's possession, but a voice dredged up from a place he had sealed away. The request carried no drama, no urgency, nothing exaggerated. Yet it aligned almost perfectly with a line he had once read in his brother's last letter from the Eastern Front. "Tell Mother I was not a bad man." Two landscapes with no connection. The pale, frozen horizon of the east and the dark, waterlogged earth of the Hürtgen Forest suddenly intersected through that single sentence. He showed no outward shock, no grief. He simply stood still, as if calculating the reactivation of a mechanism that should have remained dormant. His expression did not change, but the pressure whitening his knuckles revealed everything the face concealed. Around him, the soldiers remained unaware of the shift. They finished the inspection and pushed Hayes back into line, ready to resume the march. But the formation now tightened subtly, and their pace increased, as if everyone hoped to leave that disrupted clearing as quickly as possible. Hayes stumbled forward, the half-sheet shoved against his chest, swaying with each step. It reminded him over and over of what had been broken. He knew the missing half lay somewhere behind him, yet he also knew he would not be allowed to retrieve it. The escort moved into a sparser section of forest. Repeated bombardment had stripped many trees of branches, leaving gaps wide enough for faster movement. The ground was less forgiving. Upturned roots protruded like ribs, and water pooled in shell craters, forming thin layers of ice. Each step risked twisting an ankle. The escort grew more tense. Any delay would draw questions from the rear. Here, Hayes felt a change in how he was being handled. At first, soldiers treated him with a distant hostility maintained by discipline. But deeper into the march, irritation surfaced. In a sector where the front could collapse without warning, a prisoner was not merely a burden. He was an unwanted variable. Once, a sharp report from the rear startled the escort. A soldier nearly forced Hayes to his knees with his rifle, the motion impulsive and edged with fear. Hoffman remained along the rear half of the formation. He intervened in no overt way, but each time the tension rose, he subtly adjusted the spacing to prevent escalation. It was as if the steadiness of his march was the only element keeping the line from spiraling into disorder. His gaze drifted occasionally toward the half-letter against Hayes's chest, yet his expression revealed nothing. Only the faint shift in his breathing suggested the pressure gathering inside him. As the formation turned deeper into the forest, the terrain grew more fragmented. The wreckage of an abandoned machine gun position lay among exposed roots, its outlines softened by thin snow. Faint depressions in the ground, the shapes of those who had fallen earlier, were still visible beneath the frost, as if the forest attempted to reclaim them. The escort showed no reaction. Such sights were common, yet the march took on a weight of its own, as if the silence acknowledged what no one said aloud. A prisoner might, or might not, reach the rear, alive. Hayes's breathing grew heavier. Cold and exhaustion produced a tightening in his chest. Mud dragged at his boots. He could feel his strength declining, and he knew that slowing the pace would turn him into an obstacle with predictable consequences in terrain like this. The half-letter swayed with his movements, reminding him of the parts of himself that were being stripped away. He did not know that the missing half had fallen into the hands of a man whose own life had begun to fray. Hoffman felt an old weight stirring within him. His attention should have belonged to the route, the distance, the formation, yet the scrap of paper began to occupy the rhythm of his steps. He was not moved by the prisoner, he was pulled backward by his own unhealed fracture. His brother's death had never resolved into a closed memory. It remained a severed structure the war had never allowed him to mend. Now, a stranger's letter had reopened it. The escort advanced, but the march had changed its nature. The rigidity of protocol pressed in from one side, the resurgence of memory from the other, Hayes's fading strength from behind, and the tightening German positions from ahead. Hoffman understood that a moment would come when he alone would decide what happened. The march was not leading to a place, it was narrowing toward that moment. Before the forest recovered its voice, their fates, Hayes's life and Hoffman's fracture, had already begun to bind themselves to the torn piece of paper. By early afternoon, the escort reached a stretch of unstable ground that marked a transition zone. Here, the front resolved into a blurred boundary. Ahead lay a crossing field of dense fire, while the rear led toward temporary supply points and the company's makeshift command posts. The trees had thinned. The earth was littered with stumps, shaved flat by artillery. A faint residue of smoke hung in the air, drifting through the light like dust that refused to settle. The column halted not because of any tactical necessity, but because pressing forward with a prisoner no longer seemed required, and moving backward now meant reporting what they had done. The platoon leader emerged from behind a half-collapsed dugout. His face bore the sharp, brittle tension of someone who had gone several days and nights without real sleep. He did not ask about the prisoner or inquire into the state of the escort. He simply scanned the line with the speed of someone accustomed to compressing orders in chaos, and his gaze stopped on Hayes. The prisoner's exhaustion was obvious. His shoulders trembled slightly from the cold, his steps had grown slow, and his breathing had shortened into an uneven rhythm. Whether such a man was worth escorting any farther depended less on regulations now than on the officer's reading of the situation, and on his mood. The platoon leader turned his head toward Hoffman. The look he gave was familiar and dangerous at once. With supply lines compressed and manpower constantly forced outward, lightening the load had become an unspoken, tolerated option. He did not articulate it. Instead, he paused briefly and lowered his voice into a directionless, yet heavily suggestive phrase. "You know what to do." It was an instruction designed for no record, no witness, and no repetition. It carried no specific content, yet allowed ample space. Responsibility flowed downward. Legal edges dissolved into a gray zone. The man carrying out the order was left to decide, unobserved, how far to go. For many soldiers, such a directive implied something blunt and practical. When exhaustion and resentment had accumulated to a critical level, the psychological barrier to dealing with a burden was not particularly high. Hayes was pushed into a small clearing ringed by tree stumps. He did not understand what that ambiguous phrase meant, but something in the silence around him felt different. The escort no longer pressured him forward. The men loosened their formation, creating an empty space around him that functioned as an invisible perimeter. His boots sank lightly into the mud. He stopped, his body listing forward under the combined weight of cold and fatigue. The half-torn letter swayed at his collar, as if reminding him that this place did not resemble the terrain he had crossed before. Hoffman stood 2 paces away, standard distance for carrying out an order, yet suddenly too close. From here, he could see the exact angle of Hayes's posture, the stiff shoulders, the lowered head, the heavy, irregular breaths, the way he fought to remain upright despite having little left. The scene aligned almost perfectly with one stored deep in his memory, his last sight of his brother before evacuation from the Eastern Front. There, too, a man had been forced to sit or kneel against rough timber, his body folding in on itself as the cold advanced faster than any relief. Many soldiers hesitated when given such orders. What rose in Hoffman, however, was not hesitation, but an abrupt resistance. He could not accept that history would replay itself in front of him, using another body in the same position. He did not feel compassion for Hayes in any sentimental sense. What he could not endure was being forced to watch another figure occupying the brother's place, and then being handed over to death. This was his first true act of disobedience, not against a specific man, but against a pattern he refused to allow to close. The platoon leader stepped aside, waiting for a conclusion. No one anticipated anything unusual. The escort held its silence. A few men adjusted their straps and checked their weapons, as if filling the time until something inevitable occurred. The atmosphere carried a dull, efficient quality. Only the questions of who and when seemed to matter, not the nature of what would happen. Hoffman lowered his gaze briefly, giving the impression that he was studying the ground. In reality, he was aware of a structure inside himself tearing slightly wider with each second. If he remained silent, the ambiguous order would slide into its default outcome. The absence of action would be interpreted as consent. If he stepped out of line and intervened, he knew he would assume not only disciplinary risk, but also the cost of suspicion, labeling, and exclusion. His standing in the unit had never been secure. He was not fervent. He displayed no political zeal. Any further deviation from expectations would push him even farther to the margins. He raised his head and looked at Hayes. For a man completely spent, weighed down by mud and cold, this moment offered nothing to interpret. Hayes stood still, reduced to breath and posture. The war had stripped him to the point where only physical reactions remained visible. He did not know whether he was standing at the limit of his life, nor that someone nearby was deciding whether that line extended. Hoffman moved. He neither drew his weapon nor stepped back. He took a single step forward and helped Hayes away from the stumps. The gesture was not abrupt, but it ran completely counter to the prevailing mood. His hands acted with a deliberate steadiness, as if carrying out a procedure that, though unsupported by any rule, had become necessary. A few soldiers in the escort looked up. Their first reaction was confusion. Then, for a few seconds, their expressions locked into a rigid pause. No one immediately challenged him, yet the tension in the air shifted distinctly. He offered no explanation. He simply set Hayes back on his feet and guided him, with a small pressure on the arm, toward the rear, not toward any open space suited for a field execution, but toward the direction of an established prisoner transfer route, partially concealed by the lie of the ground. In a flat, almost clinical tone, he addressed the platoon leader with a short report. "The prisoner must be handed over to the rear." The sentence neither openly rejected the earlier hint nor acknowledged it. It relocated the question from private initiative back into institutional procedure. The platoon leader stared at him for several seconds, measuring what else might be contained in the statement. But the broader disintegration of the situation left him with little capacity to probe further. He gave a curt nod and signaled for the march to resume. Hoffman's visible exhaustion did not surprise him. At that stage of the campaign, erratic behavior was often attributed to fatigue rather than to disobedience. The escort reassembled and started moving again, but the formation had changed. Hoffman positioned Hayes farther back, where he would draw less attention. His own stride lost some of its mechanical quality and settled into a calm that follows a decision already made. The fragment of the letter at Hayes's chest continued to move in time with his steps. The missing half, now in Hoffman's pocket, lay folded against his brother's old letter, the two pieces forming a new, silent pattern. He had not saved a prisoner, at least not in his own understanding. He had preserved a part of himself that had not yet collapsed. As the column disappeared into deeper lines of trees, the consequences of the ambiguous order had already been quietly altered. No one wrote down what had happened. No one attached meaning to it. Yet on this landscape, reshaped again and again by shellfire, one life had shifted course because it intersected, for a brief moment, with another man's wound. After the escort crossed a sunken stretch deep within the forest, the tempo of the march slackened abruptly. The rough outline of a temporary German holding site emerged through the fog. marked by staked wooden fencing and a few low structures. Several clerks in worn field uniforms adjusted stacks of forms in the cold, displaying a kind of weariness, utterly unlike the tension at the front. They had grown used to processing every variety of prisoner, wounded, numb from the cold, stunned by bombardment. One more man in line did not draw particular notice. By the time Hayes was pushed toward the registration table, his sense of direction had all but dissolved. The strain of remaining on alert for so long, followed by physical depletion, had turned his steps loose and uneven. The cold wrapped itself deeper into his consciousness, dulling his awareness. He felt the pressure of the ropes around his wrists ease and then vanish, without understanding why. He only knew that he was pressed forward against a rough wooden surface, that a numbered tag was handed to him and then taken away again. The sequence of actions made no sense. His body simply moved wherever other bodies directed it. Behind this process, Hoffman left no trace of deviation. Once he had guided Hayes into the registration line, he withdrew to stand with the escort at a neutral distance, no longer interacting with the prisoner. His steps settled into the measured rhythm expected of a soldier who had carried out his assignment and now awaited the next. He understood that once the forms were filled and the entry logged, Hayes's status would pass fully into the machinery of the prisoner of war system. From that point onward, other rules, formal and impersonal, would define the man's fate. Hoffman's responsibility ended at a boundary that could not be seen, but was very clearly felt. When Hayes was led through the gate into the camp, his body crossed for the first time out of the immediate reach of frontline weather. The cutting wind of the forest gave way to a heavy, still cold. Blankets were handed out with rote efficiency. Prisoners were divided into groups and directed to low, dim shelters. Inside one of them, Hayes sank onto a rough plank or bench. As he shifted, the half-letter slipped from his collar and fell into his lap. Mud still speckled the surface. The creases were so deep that the paper could hardly be opened any further without tearing. In the muted light, he studied the line that remained whole, confirming that some part of his earlier life still survived in written form. He did not know who held the missing half now, or whether it had been destroyed, but this fragment, incomplete as it was, became his only intact proof amid the confusion, a small material argument that he had not been entirely erased from the world beyond the wire. In the weeks that followed, Hayes was moved several times within the prisoner system, from the temporary holding area to a more established rear collection point, and then to a camp farther inland. Each transfer unfolded in the same pattern: biting air on open trucks or in rail cars, crowded bodies, long stretches of waiting where conversations thinned and fell away. During these movements, his strength returned gradually. He learned to register the routines, the counts, the distributions of food. He came to understand that he now existed on the outer edge of a massive conflict, not in combat reports, but in lists. He was not executed. He was catalogued. He was not discarded. He was filed. His survival was partly a function of process, of forms, signatures, and the dull momentum of policy. Yet he also sensed that something lay beneath those mechanisms, some less visible force, that had pushed him away from the front at the exact moment when the opposite could easily have occurred. Even after the war ended, and he found himself aboard a ship bound for the United States, he kept the fragment of the letter hidden in the lining of his kit bag. By then, the paper had become dangerously fragile. A single careless fold could have shattered it. Still, he smoothed it out before every inspection, shielding it with the same care he once reserved for tools and wires. He never told any officer how the letter had been torn, nor during which march the tear had occurred. He understood that no one else would feel its weight. It was not a story to him, not in the conventional sense. It was a piece of a broken world that he alone had carried out. On the other side of the war, Hoffman was absorbed almost at once into the anonymous current of men being pushed back. The collapse around the Hürtgen sector forced rapid withdrawals. He was folded into replacement units, then shifted again, performing tasks that were repetitive, monotonous, and increasingly detached from any notion of progress. By spring, Germany's remaining supplies had thinned to the point of intermittence. Units shrank, regrouped, and fragmented again. Nothing in these movements singled out his earlier choice. No report mentioned it. No superior officer questioned him. In a maze of incomplete records, few would have noticed if a prisoner's name had failed to appear in a ledger or had appeared without a clear chain of custody. When the war ended, he returned home as one among thousands without distinction. The village to which he came back was more broken than when he had left. Pavement bricks had been loosened by concussions. Gaps between the houses yielded wild grass where rubble had settled. His mother still lived in one surviving building, the window frames crooked, the furniture scarce. Inside, the most tangible evidence of the family's past was confined to a drawer containing a small stack of letters. On top lay the last one his brother had mailed from the Eastern Front, its folds turned a deep brown. Hoffman placed the half sheet of the American's letter behind it. He did not sort them, did not explain their connection, did not mark them in any way. He acted as though the fragment had naturally earned its place there, beside the words his brother had written. No one asked where the foreign paper had come from. The atmosphere in post-war Germany was heavy and hollow. People spent their strength rebuilding fences, patching roofs, scavenging for food. Curiosity shrank, displaced by more urgent needs. Hoffman moved through this environment in silence. He was not subject to formal retribution, nor did he receive any special recognition. The war had not granted him the clarity of guilt or the clarity of heroism. It had simply worn away whatever sharp edges his life once possessed. Sometimes, in the early morning, he opened the drawer and saw the two sheets thinned further by time, lying side by side. They seemed like two people who had never met, occupying the same stillness. The sentences written on them pointed in different directions, toward different houses, different families, different languages. Yet both contained the same underlying request, that those left behind be allowed to think of the writers as something more than what the war had made of them. Rebuilding life in the United States proved slower for Hayes than he had imagined. He needed time to regain his hearing where artillery had blunted it, to adjust to air that no longer felt braced for impact, to relearn the expressions on his family's faces. He never told his children how close he had come to dying in the Hürtgen Forest. He did not mention that a stranger had intervened at precisely the point where probability had turned against him. On some nights when the house was quiet, he would take out the half letter and read that single surviving line, not to recall the forest, but to confirm that the intention he had written into the paper had not vanished with the tear. He did not know Hoffman's name, nor the conflict that had unfolded within the German ranks. The only things he could retrieve were the silence of the march, and the sense that an unseen decision had extended his life. For his part, Hoffman never learned what became of the prisoner he had steered into the system rather than toward the margin. He knew only that the fragment he had carried from the forest did not belong on the battlefield or in the mud. It had to remain somewhere, if only to attest that one day's rupture had not resulted in absolute collapse. In two countries, within two societies reshaped by war, they each carried half of a narrative forward. The conflict gave them no opportunity to meet, no platform to explain themselves, and no language to reconcile their experiences. Their actions were not recorded, celebrated, or condemned. Yet the thin, invisible line between them allowed two marginalized lives to push outward against the darkness surrounding them, each in his own confined space. The gap they created was narrow and fragile, but it was enough to tilt a single fate off its expected course. In the official histories of the war, the two men remained strangers without each other's names. Hayes appeared in the empty box reserved for prisoner numbers. Hoffman merged into the columns that listed retreating units. Their paths, as institutions understood them, never touched. Yet what truly shaped them was not the system, but a brief, imperceptible deviation. In the mud and snow of the Hürtgen Forest, Hayes's persistence was more than an anecdote. It was a tension extending outward, creating a fissure in the command structure that otherwise would have proceeded without interruption. Hoffman's wound, in turn, left its trace in another man's life, enabling Hayes, in the quiet of the post-war years, to recognize that his survival owed less to chance than to one person's refusal to repeat a personal loss. They did not receive answers from one another. Instead, their existence formed a kind of unseen mutual discipline. Hayes's despair compelled Hoffman to confront the weight of what lay beyond orders, while Hoffman's act of refusal taught Hayes that fate was not shaped exclusively by power or rank. Each man learned something indelible at the break in the other's life. War ordinarily destroys individuals as a matter of routine. Yet in certain moments of forced rupture, a person may find himself compelled to learn from the wound of a stranger. Neither Hayes nor Hoffman set out to change the world. Each was driven to the edge of his endurance. At that edge, they brushed briefly against each other's pain, and that pain shaped them in ways that left no trace in archives or testimonies. On a landscape reworked time and again by violence, they had once altered each other's course almost imperceptibly. That single deviation was enough to allow one human life to continue.